Rashi had cited over there that Bezalel had done all that Ashitziva Hashem es Moshe, all that God had commanded Moshe. All of a sudden, what Hashem had commanded Moshe, so Rashi cites the Chazal that initially Moshe had said to Bezalel, he should first oversee the development of the components, the vessels, and then the outer structure, which are the kroshim, which would contain the vessels. So Bezalel says when one builds a home, one first builds the structure and then brings the components into the structure. There seems to be the order that you tell me is not correct. So Moshe says, you know something, what you say is correct. First you build the outer structure, and then you make the components, bring them inside. And that's what it says, it's Sel Kale. Moshe says, you know, you're in the shadow of God. It's exactly what you're telling me is exactly what Hashem had said to me. So we'd mentioned Rameir Simcha, that he says before the Chet Egel, closer with the Mishkan itself. So the outer structure was no different than any other component of the Mishkan. However, once we no longer qualified that we should be the location for the Shekhinah, then the outer structure is essential because that contains everything. Because without that, the Shekhinah will not enter. Therefore, you first make the outer structure and then you make the components. So I was thinking about this. Actually, the Mishkan, when was it erected? It was first erected in Nisan. They were given the order to begin building the Mishkan on the 11th day. They started to build on the 11th day of Tishrei. That was the day after Moshe had come back with the second set of tablets, which was Yom Kippur. Yom Kippurim, that day was designated as day of forgiveness, atonement, till the end of time. When they begin building the Mishkan, the next day, told them about the materials and what's necessary. So the next few months, the Mishkan was developed, but factually there was a number of months till it was finally erected. That was first erected in Nisan. So if that's the case, does it really make a difference what you make first? Whether you make the vessels first or the outer, wherever they had to store it, they stored it during this period of time. If you actually have to store it somewhere, so you say, first you build the outer structure, and then you bring the inner part of the whatever is needed to facilitate the function of that residence. But over here, it's totally irrelevant. What difference make if you commission the vessels first or the kroshim or the outer structure, which are the vertical beams? That's what bothered me. Ramban, in his introduction to the Parsha, he explains, he said, Sefer Zeh, Hu Torah's Kohanim Leviyim. This book is the Torah which relates to Kohanim Leviyim. Yivarbo inyoni hakarbonos kulon umishmeres hamishkan. We will explain all the aspects of the korban, all the korbanos, sacrifices, umishmeres hamishkan, and the various watches which took place in the Mishkan with the Leviyim. Kikasher hoyos sefer echad bin agolus v'gulu mimenu v'shlimu binyan ol moed v'kova Hashem shemili es Mishkan. He says after the previous book spoke about the golus and gula, the exile and the redemption, and the completion of the ol moed, and the kovet shechina, and the appropriateness for the Shekhinah, which filled the Mishkan. That was the end of Parshas Pekudei. Tzivo bekorbanos ushmiras hamishkan. He commanded us with korbanos and to oversee the Mishkan. Shu korbanos kapor lohem. The korbanos are an atonement. V'lo havonos l'sil Shekhinah. This is important. And the sin should not cause the Shekhinah to depart from us. V'tziva b'kohanim and the goshim el Hashem, she's kadoshu. And he commanded us that the kohanim have to be sanctified. She is al tumas big kadoshav, and therefore there's a prohibition to contaminate the big dosh and its sacrifices. Gam shlo yersu lavos el Hashem, and they're not permitted to enter there. Unless you qualify to enter into the Mishkan, you're not permitted. He's going to say something interesting, which he said earlier. Moshinema daber al Aaron ochicha al yovo b'cholis lakodesh libis leparochas al pnei akapores asher Aaron. Aaron himself, after his sons were struck down, the Torah tells us, even Aaron was not permitted to go El HaKodesh with the Kaporises, because that is the location of the Shekhinah, only in Yom Kippur. He's only permitted to go there when he's permitted. V'lo yomus, ki be'onon eiroi la Kapores, because Hashem says, I will appear with the honor, with the cloud on the Kapores, the cover of the Aron. Kasores pen yersu el Hashem liros v'nofim en arov. It says by Sinai that they're not permitted to approach the mountain, because if they do approach the mountain to see Hashem, many will fall. There'll be many casualties. What did the Kroshim represent? To set off that location, to identify the perimeter of that location. That's Kabbalas Har Sinai. They say Yosham Kovet Al Israel. This is a famous word from Rabbi Simcha. In the Mishkan, in the desert when we traveled, you erected the Levium, they would erect the vertical beams, and then they would bring the various components of the Mishkan into the Mishkan, and then you had the various areas. You had the Kochi Kadoshim, you had the location where the Oron was, the Paroches, the covered sanctuary, which was the Shulchan and the Menorah, and the Mizbach HaZohav, the gold altar. Then you had the outer courtyard, which you had the what we call the Mizbach HaNechoshes, the copper altar, which you brought the sacrifices. Before they assembled it, what was the location? It was just desert. Once you assembled it and you created that infrastructure of the Mishkan and the various locations, now there's certain areas you're permitted to go, you're not permitted to go. Even the Kohen Gadol, he's not permitted to go with the Kodesh Kadoshim once it's been assembled. When it's dismantled, it no longer exists. So everything is contained within the parameters of the Kroshim. You set up the Kroshim, you bring the various components, and now it assumes that profile, now the Shekhinah enters. It's dismantled, the Shekhinah is no longer there, because it's only contained within the Mishkan. It's only Mishkan when it's erected and everything is in place the way prescribed by Hashem. When did the Shekhinah come down on Har Sinai? The Jews encircled Sinai. The 600,000 men above the age of 20, plus the rest of Klaus, encircled the mountain. When the mountain was encircled with Klal Yisrael, after the third day, the Shekhinah descends onto the mountain. He says that's exactly what's happening here. Once the Kroshim are assembled with everything inside, now the Kohen is, even Aaron is not permitted to go with the Kodesh Kadoshim. As it says by the mountain, you cannot approach the mountain because the mountain is holy. And why is it holy? Because the Shekhinah is there. Identically, the Kroshim are the equivalent of the encirclement of the mountain. So Rameir Simcha says something interesting. Wherever Klal Yisrael is, we exist as a people. That's where the Shekhinah is in this world. Hashem says, even in your state of contamination, I dwell in your midst. There is a connection to us. Because Klal Yisrael are always the equivalent of the Kroshim. Wherever the Kroshim are, that's where the Shekhinah is. Who are the Kroshim? Just as at Sinai, when we encircled the mountain, that was the context for the Shekhinah to enter into this existence. Where Klal Yisrael is, that's the basis for the Shekhinah to enter into this existence. Okay? And that's what he says here. That setting up the Kroshim is the equivalent of the encirclement of the mountain for the Shekhinah to come. Identically here, therefore, the Torah speaks about the laws where the Kohen is permitted to go, where he's not permitted to go, and the laws of spiritual contamination. When is he qualified and when is he not qualified? Okay, that's the Ramban. Over there is the famous Balaturim. The word Vayikra, the letter of Vayikra is written small in the Sefer Torah. It's not the same size as the rest of the letters of Vayikra. So here, the Malaturim writes, Aleph, the Vayikra Zero. Zero. The Aleph, the word Vayikra is written small. Shemoshe Yegodol V'onov, Lo Rotze Lichtov Ela Vayikor, Lo Shemikre. Moshe wanted it should be written Vayikor. We come from the word Mikra, it was only like happenstance. It happened to be Hashem appeared to Moshe. That God only spoke to him in a sleep state, not in the wake state, the way he communicated with Bilam. Kilo nira lo Hashem elo b'mikra. Only once in a while. It wasn't like an ongoing relationship where you speak face to face. But Hashem says, no, we're going to write the Aleph. Because due to his level of humility, Moshe Rabbeinu says, okay, if Hashem wants to write it smaller than the others to indicate that I don't want it to be identified with me, that I'm something special. And because of that request, Hashem wrote it smaller. To Vayikar, which is establishing what the essence of the relationship was, that it's Ponim El Ponim, is through that Aleph. But what it tells us is, why was Moshe Rabbeinu Ponim El Ponim? Because that's exactly who he is. We say, the Gemara tells us, if you flee honor, honor pursues you. Moshe Rabbeinu fled from honor. Why? Because he felt he was so negated to Hashem, it would have been the ultimate arrogance if he would have put himself into the equation. That he should be identified, that he has any level of worthiness would be considered something disgraceful for him. Therefore, he says, I don't want to be identified. It has to do with me. It's only you. Hashem says, no, but reality is it is you. Because you chose to be who you are, so there was an agreement, we'll write it smaller than the others to indicate who you are. That you really, it's not something you wanted, but that's why exactly it was Ponim El Ponim. Vayikra represents, when you speak to a person, speaking means I speak to you face to face. It's not like the Chalom, which is Mikra. That's not the way a person communicates with someone else. Okay, now, the Ramchal writes in the Derech Hashem that every prophet profited the Chalom, not Behokitz, not in the wake state. Why? Because a human being has a physical component and you have a spiritual component. A human being is a composite of the neshama and the body. The neshama is spiritual, the body is physical. The body, because of its physical makeup, does not have the capacity to connect with the Shekhinah, that the divine presence should exist within that, connect to it. So he says, the Ramchal writes, that when a Novi prophesies in the sleep state, literally the person should die. Because a human being only lives because his soul is in his body. But if once the body is not able to contain the soul any longer, the person dies. The intensity of the Shekhinah, when it connects to the neshama, when a prophet prophesizes, it's directly to the soul. It's not through the human faculty, which is the brain. It's the neshama. But when it enters into the neshama, and the neshama is in the body is not able to tolerate that intensity of Shekhinah, and the person really should die. So Hashem has the will, like it's the equivalent of put the person on life support, that he should be able to survive that experience, otherwise he would die. And therefore, if you read a Navi, whenever he start prophesying, he'd be in a wake state. It's not only when he slept. He would start convulsing, like he had like an epileptic fit, and we'd fall to the ground, and he'd go unconscious, and he'd be literally convulsing, because the body wasn't able to tolerate that intensity of Shekhinah. Why? Because the body is physical and the soul is spiritual. Moshe Rabbeinu was so spiritualized, he had taken his physicality and he elevated it to a spiritual level. That's what he did. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu was able to prophesy in a wake state. Moshe Rabbeinu, when he wanted to communicate with Hashem, he says, I would like to see Hashem's countenance. What did Hashem say to Moshe Rabbeinu? Lo yirani odom v'choy. A human being cannot see my presence and live. He cannot tolerate it. Even Moshe Rabbeinu, to have that direct level of contact with Hashem, he couldn't survive. He says, you'll see me ma'achoroi. You'll see me, whatever that means, from behind. So Rashi cites Chazal, he showed him Kesher Shel Tefillin. He showed him the Kesher of the Tefillin. But the front, to have that level of understanding, he did not have. Because lo yirani odom v'choy. A human being doesn't have the capacity, even Moshe Rabbeinu, as spiritualized as his physicality was, you cannot survive it. You cannot tolerate that intensity of Shekhinah. That's what it is. So Moshe, every other prophet was b'chalom, not b'hokitz. Now, I'd once mentioned a Sipurno. The Sefarno says, at Sinai, all the Jews prophesied in a wake state, not in a sleep state. When Hashem spoke to us, gave us the Aser Sadibros, he spoke to us ponim el ponim, face to face. Why? But we weren't qualified. Moshe Rabbeinu was qualified. Why? Because it was essential that Klal should understand that reality is possible if Hashem wills that reality. They had to personally experience that to understand what the dimension of Moshe's prophecy was. That Moshe Rabbeinu is pale peh adabebo. God speaks to him face to face, mouth to mouth, as two people speak. After that, no one was ever at that level again. It was only to indicate that such a thing is possible in this existence, that a human being can, if you're at that level. Klaus or not. And what did they say? Let you, Moshe, you be the intermediary. Because if we continue hearing Hashem's voice, we're going to die. Because they weren't at the level to be able to tolerate that level of communication. Therefore, they asked Moshe Rabbeinu should be the intermediary between them and Hashem for that reason. Probably the Gemara, when a person gave a shear, it was through an intermediary. It was called the Meturgaman. Meturgaman literally means a translator. But so how did it work? And it's based on Gemara and Brachos. The Rosh Hashiva, or the lecturer, would say the shear, and the level of audibility was loud enough that the students heard the Rebbe's voice, and then the intermediary, the spokesman, would repeat exactly verbatim what the Rebbe had said and gives it over to the students. At the same level of audibility, the exact same words, the same words as the Rebbe. When the students ask the question, they ask the question to the intermediary, and the Rebbe hears the question, and then the intermediary brings the question to the Rebbe, and this is the interaction through the intermediary. So the question is why? The students hear the Rebbe giving over the information. It's a level they hear. The Meturgaman, the intermediary, when he gives it over, his level of audibility cannot be louder than the Rebbe's voice. It has to be the same level of audibility. And the words he says are verbatim what the Rebbe had said. So let's cut out the middleman, go straight. Go directly from the Rebbe to the students. The Gemara says, you know why? Because when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Torah to Moshe, to Klal Yisrael, to Moshe Rabbeinu, when he spoke to Moshe, we heard Hashem's voice. And Moshe just went up, repeated what Hashem had said. When the Jews asked the question, anything, they presented it to Moshe. Moshe then presented it to Hashem. When we asked the question, Hashem knew what we were asking. But yet, the relationship was through the intermediary, which Moshe Rabbeinu was the intermediary between Hashem and Klal Yisrael. Meaning, the way one merits the siyata d'shmaya of Torah to be able to fully come upon its truth, it's only if this is the process. It's through the intermediary. Therefore, we have to replicate Sinai every time we disseminate Torah. It's through that, within that profile of the Sinai communication, which is through an intermediary. That's the reason. So the Gemara tells over a story that there was a certain Amori, he had a Meturgaman. And when he would say the shir, the Maturgamon did not say over what the Rebbe had said. He gave over his own Torah. So, and a colleague was there, and he saw what was going on. He says, and the Rebbe didn't say a word. He was okay with it. He says, until now, I thought I was humble. Now I realize I'm not really humble because I couldn't have tolerated what this man is tolerating. That this intermediary had the chutzpah, had the audacity, where he says one thing, and then the Maturga, the intermediary, says over his own Torah as if it's the one who told him the Torah. Okay? He couldn't relate to that level of humility. You understand? How do you tolerate it? You know, what about me? I'm so-called the Rebbe. You're my students, and he's taking over the role as if he's the Rebbe. How do you tolerate it? So do we understand what humility is? There's not a trace of yourself, never to be, ever have your feathers ruffled, not because you feel you're a nobody. You know who you are. Moshe Rabbeinu knew who he was. When it came to break the luchos, he broke the luchos. That was his own understanding. That was the right thing to do. However, despite knowing who he was totally negated to Hashem. And that's the Vayikra. Hashem says, no, it has that aleph we have to have. You want to have some kind of compromise, have it smaller, we'll have it smaller. So I'm accommodating your wishes, but it has to be stated. But that tells us volumes of who Moshe Rabbeinu was.